What happens when a tired nurse walks into court straight from a 14-hour shift, and the judge humiliates her in front of everyone? You ever have one of those nights where it feels like the world's problems all land in your lap at once? That was Nurse Danielle Pryor's Thursday night at St. Vincent's Hospital in Toledo, Ohio. 14 hours. No real breaks. 3 emergency surgeries, a code blue in the pediatric unit, and a family who wouldn't stop crying after losing their father to a stroke. Danielle handled it all with that same quiet strength she'd built over years of holding lives together when nobody else could. By the time her shift ended, the sun was just peeking over the Maumee River. She looked down at herself, wrinkled blue scrubs, sneakers that had seen better days, and a coffee stain across her left knee from around 3 a.m. She thought about going home, about grabbing a shower, maybe even an hour of sleep. But there was something she couldn't shake. She had promised Mrs. Rainey she would show up in court. Mrs. Rainey, the elderly patient who slipped on an unmarked wet floor at the grocery store, breaking her hip and nearly losing her independence because of someone else's negligence. Danielle had seen it herself when Mrs. Rainey arrived in the ER, trembling, alone, terrified. She knew firsthand what Mrs. Rainey went through, and her testimony could mean the difference between justice and nothing. So, dirty scrubs or not, Danielle grabbed a black zip-up hoodie from her locker, tied her curls into a loose bun, and headed for the courthouse downtown. It wasn't about looking good. It was about doing good. The courthouse sat heavy in the middle of Monroe Street, a tall, aging building with cracks running along the concrete steps. Danielle had passed it 100 times without much thought, but today it felt different, heavier, like she was walking straight into a place where people didn't know her story, didn't know her heart, and maybe wouldn't even care to listen. Still, she squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and pushed through the heavy doors. But inside, a different kind of exhaustion waited, one she hadn't seen coming. The security guard at the front barely looked up as Danielle shuffled through the metal detector, the cold plastic bin swallowing up her hospital ID badge and keys. She grabbed them without a word and followed the overhead signs toward Courtroom 2B. Every step echoed. Every hallway smelled faintly like old paper and cleaner. Danielle pushed the door open and slipped inside quietly, rows of polished wooden benches stretched out before her. Lawyers in stiff suits whispered by the windows. Jurors leaned back in their chairs, waiting. A court reporter tapped her nails against a laptop, bored. Nobody seemed to notice Danielle at first. She moved to sit in the back, trying to stay invisible. But there was something about her. The soft shuffle of her sneakers, the out-of-place blue of her scrubs, that drew eyes anyway. One woman, wearing a pearl necklace, elbowed the man next to her. He gave a half smirk. A teenage boy with shaggy hair whispered something behind his hand. Danielle felt the burn of a dozen silent judgments all at once. She gripped her hands together in her lap, forcing herself to stay calm. The bailiff called the room to order as the judge entered. Judge Marissa Dalton, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, silver-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, climbed the steps to her seat behind the bench. She had a reputation around Toledo, fair but strict, real old school about what she called respect for the institution. Danielle stood along with everyone else, sat when they sat, tried to fold herself into the rhythm of the room. They called the docket, read out the names, and the attorneys made their opening moves. It was when Danielle's name was finally called that everything cracked open. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her scrubs without thinking, and made her way to the witness stand. Her sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished floor. Judge Dalton's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward just a little, squinting at Danielle like she wasn't quite sure what she was looking at. Before Danielle could even take her seat, the judge spoke. "Ms. Pryor, are you aware of proper courtroom attire?" Her voice was clipped, loud enough that heads turned. "Because what you're wearing is not appropriate for these proceedings." The courtroom went still, like someone sucked all the air out. Danielle opened her mouth, then closed it. Her cheeks flamed hot. She glanced at the attorney who had called her, a thin, balding man named Mr. Simons, but he just looked down at his papers, pretending not to notice. Judge Dalton didn't move. She just stared. "Appearances matter," the judge continued. "This is a court of law, not a hospital." A few snickers bubbled from the back of the room. Danielle felt her stomach flip. She hadn't even spoken yet, hadn't told them about the boy she performed CPR on, the woman she had comforted as she took her last breath, the hands she had held while death crept in. She was here to honor a promise, and somehow all they could see was the fabric she wore. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to break down right there. But the fire building inside her wasn't something she could ignore much longer. Danielle sat, her hands folded tight in her lap, the hard wooden chair creaking under her. Judge Dalton hadn't taken her eyes off her. "Miss Pryor," the judge said again, her voice slicing through the heavy air, "do you think this courtroom is casual? That it's a place where one strolls in wearing work clothes?" Danielle glanced down at herself, the pale blue scrubs, the hospital ID badge still clipped to her chest. She looked out over the courtroom. Every set of eyes felt like a thumb pressing down on her. "No, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I would have expected more consideration from someone summoned to testify," Judge Dalton went on. "At the very least, a change of clothes to reflect the seriousness of these proceedings." Danielle opened her mouth, but the judge wasn't finished. "Respect must be given to the court, regardless of circumstance," she said. "This is not a place for—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Hospital uniforms." A low murmur ran through the room like static. A woman near the front crossed her arms, nodding in approval. A man in the back whispered something that made the teenager next to him snort. Danielle felt a tightness rise in her chest, hot and trembling. She could have said nothing, could have bitten her tongue, given a polite apology, tried to disappear into the day like so many times before. But something inside her, some stubborn flame fed by every double shift, every missed birthday, every time her work went unseen because of the skin she was in or the clothes she wore, refused to stay silent. She looked up, met Judge Dalton's eyes, steady and strong. "Your Honor," Danielle said, her voice clear but trembling slightly. "I came straight from my shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. I spent the last 14 hours working in the ICU. I performed CPR on a 6-year-old boy who didn't make it. I held his mother's hand when she screamed into the night." A pause. You could have heard a pin drop. "I comforted a woman who lost her husband of 52 years to a sudden stroke," Danielle continued, her voice gaining strength. "I changed bedpans, cleaned wounds, fought for patients nobody else had time to fight for." The courtroom was stone silent. Even Mr. Simons had finally looked up from his papers, his mouth slightly open. Danielle stood now, slowly, her knees stiff from exhaustion. "I didn't have time to change," she said, her voice steady. "Because after finishing my shift, I made a choice. I chose to come here, to tell the truth, to honor a promise I made to a woman who deserves justice." She took a breath, standing taller. "Respect isn't in the clothes I wear, Your Honor. It's in the life I live." She said it without anger, without bitterness, just a simple, raw truth that filled every corner of the room. For a long moment, Judge Dalton said nothing. She looked at Danielle, really looked. Not at the scrubs, not at the sneakers, but at the woman standing there, like a mountain, refusing to move. In the front row, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Near the back, the teenage boy slouched lower in his seat, his smirk gone. Danielle stayed where she was, breathing hard but not backing down. She had come here to tell the truth, and somehow, in a way she hadn't expected, she already had. But what happened next was something nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. For a few seconds, the courtroom stayed locked in silence, hanging in the air like heavy smoke. Judge Dalton shifted slightly in her chair. Her fingers tapped once, twice against the edge of the bench. Maybe she was thinking about what to say next. Maybe trying to cling to the rules she lived by for decades. But Danielle didn't wait for permission. She knew she had to finish what she started. "I didn't come here to disrespect anyone," she said, her voice softer now but still firm. "I came here because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to be hurt, and then have everyone pretend like nothing happened." She paused, scanning the faces in the room. Some looked down, uncomfortable. Others stared, riveted. "I promised Mrs. Rainey I would speak for her," Danielle continued, "because sometimes people without power, the elderly, the poor, people who don't fit a neat picture of what respectable looks like, they get overlooked." Her words weren't loud. She wasn't yelling. But somehow, they carried farther than any shouting match ever could. Every day, people walk past someone lying on the sidewalk, Assume a man in scrubs must be a janitor. Assume a tired black woman in a hospital uniform is less worthy of attention than someone in a suit, Danielle said. She took a step forward, toward the bench. The bailiff looked nervous for a second, but Judge Dalton raised her hand, a small gesture, allowing it. I'm tired, Danielle said, her voice breaking just a little. I'm tired of pretending that saving lives is somehow less important than looking the part. I don't have the luxury of fresh clothes when a mother is watching her child take his last breath. Her hands shook slightly now, but she kept going. I stand here in these scrubs because they are my armor. They carry the stories of the people I couldn't save, and they carry the pride of the ones I did. Somewhere near the back, a man in a navy blazer cleared his throat loudly, trying, and failing, to cover the sound of a sniffle. Judge Dalton leaned back in her seat. For the first time that morning, she looked less like a gatekeeper and more like someone human, someone who had been hit right where it hurt most, the heart. Danielle finished with a quiet exhale. I may not look how you expected, she said, softer now, but I am exactly where I need to be. She stepped back, sat down slowly, and for a second, it felt like the whole room was frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, a woman near the front row stood up. It was Mrs. Rainey's daughter, a woman in her 50s, wearing a simple green dress and scuffed heels. Her hands trembled, but her face was lit with something fierce and proud. She clapped, once, twice, and then more people joined. A man in a dark suit, a teenage boy who shoved his phone into his pocket and clapped with both hands, lawyers, jurors, even people who'd only been there waiting for other cases. The sound filled the room, loud and real and unstoppable. Danielle sat frozen for a moment, stunned. The courtroom wasn't supposed to be a place where people clapped. It was supposed to be solemn, controlled, silent. But in that moment, none of the old rules mattered. The bailiff looked at Judge Dalton, unsure whether he should call for order, but the judge shook her head slowly, almost in disbelief, and let it happen. Danielle blinked rapidly, fighting the tears rising fast. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't an afterthought. She wasn't just a uniform. She was seen, really seen. The applause faded, but the electricity stayed. Judge Dalton leaned forward, clearing her throat. Ms. Pryor, she said, her voice different now, softer, touched with something that sounded suspiciously like regret. The court recognizes your dedication. Thank you for your service, both here and beyond. Danielle nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't win a medal, she didn't get a trophy, but she got something she hadn't even realized she needed. Her dignity, placed back in her hands by a room full of strangers who finally understood what real respect looked like. But even though that moment was powerful, the day wasn't over yet, and Danielle was about to face one more unexpected choice. As the applause died down, Danielle sat still, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wiped her palms on the fabric of her scrubs, grounding herself in the moment. Judge Dalton cleared her throat again, a faint pink coloring her cheeks. Let's proceed, she said, finally, her voice steady but missing that hard edge it had before. Mr. Simons, your witness. Mr. Simons stumbled to his feet, clearly rattled by the raw emotion that had just ripped through the courtroom. His papers shuffled noisily as he tried to regain his composure. Danielle answered his questions simply and clearly. She explained what she saw the day Mrs. Rainey was brought into the ER. The bruising, the broken hip, the emotional trauma. She spoke of the physical signs she recognized immediately, the way Mrs. Rainey had whispered she was scared she'd never walk again. Her testimony, once feared to be a formality, now carried the weight of every life she'd touched. When the opposing counsel tried to pick at her, asking whether maybe Mrs. Rainey's injury could have been pre-existing, Danielle stood firm, calm, professional, unshaken. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, she was finally dismissed. She gathered her things slowly. She felt the stares, but they were different now. Less curious, less judgmental, warmer, grateful. As Danielle turned to leave, Judge Dalton spoke again. Ms. Pryor, she said, stopping her mid-step. Danielle turned, waiting. The judge looked at her carefully, choosing her words with visible care. You remind us that sometimes the measure of a person's respect isn't written in a dress code, she said. It's written in their sacrifice. The courtroom stayed silent, listening. "I apologize," Judge Dalton added, her voice steady. "Not just for myself, for all the time society measures the wrong things." Danielle felt something deep inside her loosen, like a fist finally unclenching after years of holding tight. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. She walked through the heavy courtroom doors, the same ones she'd entered feeling invisible, and stepped into the sunlight. Outside, Toledo felt different. Not cleaner, not shinier, just clearer. Like maybe for once, people had stopped long enough to really see what mattered. She pulled her hoodie tighter around her shoulders and headed for the hospital parking lot where her car was waiting, dented and dusty, but hers. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But for once, she wasn't fighting alone. But as Danielle walked toward her car, she couldn't help thinking about the people who wouldn't have gotten the same chance she did. And that thought sparked something even bigger inside her. Danielle sat behind the wheel of her old Corolla, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, engine humming low. She stared out at the courthouse across the street, a building she used to think had nothing to do with her real life, her real battles. But today had changed that. Today, she saw just how deep the surface judgments could go, and just how powerful one voice, even a tired one, even in wrinkled scrubs, could really be. The world didn't hand out standing ovations often. Most days, it handed out silence, shrugs, doorways quietly closing. But Danielle realized something important sitting there. The dignity she fought for in that courtroom wasn't just about her. It was about the next nurse rushing straight from work to a parent-teacher meeting only to be stared at because they looked too tired to belong. It was about the cashier in a worn apron, treated like furniture by customers. It was about every invisible worker who kept the world running while the world barely noticed. That courtroom didn't just owe Danielle an apology, it owed every one of them one too. And she knew she couldn't stop at one speech, one moment, one room clapping for her. Danielle pulled her phone from her pocket, her hands still slightly trembling from the emotional weight of the morning. She opened a blank notes file and typed something simple. "One day, the uniform will not decide who deserves respect." She sat with those words for a long moment, then added another line underneath. "Until then, speak up anyway." A tear slipped down her cheek, warm and unexpected. She wiped it away quickly, because there were still shifts to work, still lives to save, still promises to keep, to Mrs. Rainey, to herself, to everyone who would come after her. She started the car, the old engine grumbling to life. As she pulled away from the curb, Danielle wasn't thinking about courtrooms or judges or even Mrs. Rainey's case. She was thinking about the next time someone looked at her and only saw tired eyes, messy hair, old sneakers, and how she'd lift her chin, straighten her spine, and remind them, maybe not with a speech, maybe not with applause, but with her actions, that respect isn't stitched into what you wear. It's sewn into the life you live. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people spoke up when it counted, someday, it wouldn't take a courtroom full of strangers to make someone feel seen. If you ever find yourself in a room where someone decides your worth based on how you look, or what you're wearing, or how tired you seem, remember this: your value isn't up for debate. Your dignity isn't measured by fabric, or titles, or first impressions. It's measured by your heart. Speak up, stand tall, be the reason someone feels seen today. Because the world doesn't change because one person makes a speech. It changes when all of us stop pretending not to see what really matters.